Welcome to Upended Overnight. Before we get started, I want to get just a couple things out of the way. Yes, this will be recorded sometime in the not too distant future. After this is over, you will get an email. That email will contain a link, and that link will lead to the recording. I'm not sure when that will be. I think Zoom has had some issues processing videos since there's been a lot more people using it lately, but that will come at some point. If you have any questions throughout this webinar, feel free to ask them in the Q&A box. That should be down on the bottom panel of your Zoom window. So we will try to answer those questions as they come in. If we don't, then we will probably write some sort of follow-up blog that answers those questions. So again, welcome. We wanted to spend some time in this webinar talking about the changes that have taken place sort of over the last 30 to 60 days as we've transitioned from, a traditional working world to one where we are entirely distributed. And we wanted to look at it through the lens of finance for a couple reasons. One is that finance is kind of a bellwether for the information security industry in like kind of a yin and a yang sort of way. On the one hand, they get hit by all the attacks, every sophistication level, a wide variety of attacks. And we're talking everything from relatively unsophisticated, like hacktivist type attacks, to commoditized criminal attacks, to very sophisticated state level attacks. And then on the other side of that coin, they also are early adopters of technology. They are well-funded, and they tend to have very, very good visibility into the attacks they face. In addition to that, Red Canary and Carbon Black both produced good reporting last year that had a lot of insights into threats that finance organizations faced in 2019. So that gives us like a nice comparative through which we can sort of say, like, this is what it was like, here's how things are going to change, and what might that look like moving forward. So without further ado, we have gathered a group of panelists here today, pretty much all of which who have extensive security experience, a good deal of IT experience, and also have worked to some degree either at a bank or with banks. So I'm Brian Donahue. I work at Red Canary. I'm one of the authors of the threat detection report that we produce every year. And beyond that, I help with research production. I mainly just write and talk about computer security. I'm here today with my doppelganger, Michael Haig. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks. Thanks, Brian. I'm glad we're not wearing the same shirt today. Michael Haig. I've been with Red Canary almost 4 years now. My focus has been on threat research, adversary emulation. And so before Red Canary, I worked as a security architect for a Fortune 150, where I had helped build out the security program there. So yeah.
Next panelist is Rick McElroy. Why don't you tell us about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Rick McElroy, I'm friend of Mike Haig. Actually, I think Mike started at Red Canary a month or two after I started at Carbon Black, sounds about right, or within 3 months. Yeah, so I've been building security programs for a long time, and finally got talked into coming over to the dark side with a vendor. But what's really cool about my role now is I get to look at all the threat research, help co-author those, and then provide consulting and trusted advisory services to our customers that are out there, right? In addition to getting on webinars and running my mouth.
And then last but not least, we have our panelist who actually works for a financial organization, Carlos Sanchez. Why don't you tell us about yourself?
Hi guys, Carlos Sanchez. Unfortunately, I didn't start working at Carbon Black or at Red Canary anytime soon. Been working in global payments for about 3 years now. I'm director of the global security office, where our main task is to the security of the programs nationwide. Actually, sorry, not nationwide, worldwide. Throughout global payments. Before global payments, I was at a health company as an information security officer there.
All right, so today we're going to talk about what's gone on over the last 60 or so days. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about what Carbon Black and Red Canary observed in 2019 based on data from our threat reports, the Red Canary Threat Detection Report and Carbon Black's 2020 Cybersecurity Outlook Report. Then we're going to sort of talk about the present, or maybe you would call it like the near past, which is basically like how we've transitioned from the way things have always been to the way they are now. Then we're going to take a quick look at sort of 2020 and beyond. So like how things may go back to normal, how they may not. And then finally, we're going to close with some guidance on sort of like what you can take away from this talk and apply in your security program, tomorrow. And then after that, if we have any questions that we haven't answered throughout this webinar, then we will jump into those. So moving ahead. So as we've referenced at least twice now, like our threat reports came out earlier this year, maybe late last year for Carbon Black, and they had some interesting findings. So Mike Hague, this here is the top 10 MITRE attack techniques that we observed across our financial customers in 2019. Mike, can you tell me like sort of why this top 10 is the way it is? And I've sort of been thinking about it in terms of like organizing these into 3 categories that are sort of, how an adversary gets into your environment, how they move around in your environment, and then ultimately how they make money.
Yeah, so it's exactly kind of how I was looking at it as well, was you can start to peel these back and look at it from like the MITRE attack matrix as far as like tactics go. What you see is you're seeing your initial access with your spear phishing attachment. So generally everything's been coming in that way. So if you think about like emotet leading to TrickBot. So then down to execution, we continue to see PowerShell being used by organized crime groups, nation state actors, whatever it may be. PowerShell still widely used out there in the wild. And credential dumping, we're seeing more and more credential dumping just with the widespread use of like tools like MIMIKATZ and anything else that pretty much even just open source tools like ProcDump, right? And then admin shares, I'm just kind of highlighting the top 3 here at the top. But for like admin shares, we still continue to see tools either spreading laterally, hitting admin shares, or like emotet using just named pipes or just kind of shares that way. Just being able to perform those types of execution and move within organizations that way. So try to, from our angle, if you look at it from just the high level tactics and just kind of spread down that line of how they're performing those techniques, this is more or less how we broke it out within our report.
And then Rick, how does that sort of align or divert from, or deviate rather from what Carbon Black observed throughout 2019?
Yeah, no, I think it's complementary, right? So we think of it the same way, right? Like what's the initial access? Typically that's going to be some piece of malware. I think broadly what we've observed over 2018 into 2019 is like the categories of malware starting to break down, right? So saying emotet is just a Trojan anymore, like it's really not, right? It's really a malware dropper that then they use to pull different payloads that do different things, right? So whether that's, I'm gonna go pull MIMIKATZ and start to do credential dumping. But what we've seen is like over the last 3 years, there's been this rise in sophistication from the actors, right? Probably fueled by the trickle-down cyber economy. So as you get releases from nation states, those releases make their way into common malware, and those cycles have really gone from like a year to months, right? So once a new technique's observed in the wild, like Eternal Blue, it's weaponized within 90 days and then pushed out. And I think a couple of the highlights, right, is how much automated evasion is actually baked into the malware, right? So a lot of folks aren't aware of the capabilities of some of these bad actor groups, meaning I've purchased and/or stood up systems with all of the defensive tools on it. And then I continually repack my code in an automated fashion until I'm sure it can bypass it, right? Which becomes, I think, even more critical for something like endpoint detection and response. But look, the real concerning thing is things like ransomware, right? So ransomware is probably the top category for malware. Unfortunately, ransomware isn't just ransoming systems now. You'll see ransomware start to pull credentials. You'll see ransomware deliver destructive payloads, i.e. I'm an attacker and you didn't pay me fast enough. Therefore, my punitive action is I'm going to delete logs. I'm going to start to destroy parts of your systems because I'm a little punitive and upset. And so look, I don't think if you're looking at prevention and detection for the initial vector, which is typically malware delivered via a spearfish, Like you got to look at two categories, stopping credential harvesting and stopping lat movement. And I think those two, right? So if I abstract all of this down to two areas where I'm going to focus prevention and detection, those are the two.
And then Carlos, so I think like the most important question we can ask, like obviously Mike and I and Rick and I, we all sit on the vendor side. We're looking at it from the outside. Do the things that we have observed across our customers align with the things that you're observing on the ground, or maybe just the things that you are generally concerned about or that you're prioritizing in your security program? You're on mute.
So I guess the shortcut didn't work today. Anyhow, yes, excellent question. And I'll go ahead and say what Rick and Mike said are basically on point. Everything you guys are actually showing are the things that can actually keep us up at night. I'm not saying, I mean, I can't really say exactly what's gone through my desk and all that stuff, but as a security professional, these are the type of same threats that actually keep us up at night. Things like what Rick mentioned when it comes to spear phishing, trick bots, how we get in, the malware actually coming in, and then after that, propagating through the environment. That's where, what we want to focus on. So yes, having tools that actually concentrate on those type of behaviors is great for our environment. Most threat sharing centers would tell you that these are the top of the list. So I would agree completely with everything that's been said so far.
Awesome. So that's like the, very high level overview of the stuff that we observed throughout 2019. And at the end of the webinar, I'll drop links to the two reports that we referenced there so you guys can sort of take a deeper look if you'd like to. However, as I'm sure everyone is aware, like things changed fundamentally in early March, and we all sort of had to go back to our houses. And we want to spend a good deal of time here talking about sort of how those changes affect the operations of security and to some degree the operations of IT as well, and potentially like how it might actually shape or not shape the threat landscape as we move forward. So we're going to organize these into like a people, processes, technology thing here. So let's start out with Carlos with sort of the general question here. So what are you seeing as the human ramifications of these changes?
Well, I can tell you that when we talk about what's happened in the past couple months, we're talking about from a security standpoint, a lot of work hours. So security and IT. I mean, getting people prepared to get ready for this environment, for this new normal that we have, is probably where me as a professional has probably seen the most uptick. And we're talking about a very positive skewed bell curve, where at the beginning, we're looking at, a lot of hours, man hours, preparing for this stuff. We're taking what we used to be a secure environment inside a building where we actually knew what was going in and out. We had the right security tools at the perimeter protecting us, to a more diversified and very expanded place where nowadays we have to go ahead and prepare for that. So as far as the work hours, we're talking about a lot of work hours put into the front. Hopefully now, as we've gone into this now about a month and a half into where we are, our work hours are a little bit back to normal. Yes, we're looking at different things, and we'll get into that later on in the webinar. But our work hours have actually decreased a little bit. Now the thing is, from a security standpoint, I've actually noticed that I'm doing a lot more talking to folks in different time zones at later times, because I don't have to worry about going to the office, getting in a car, doing my normal commute. So my office hours now become, it's a new normal, now become anytime. So anytime somebody wants to talk to me, I can get on the phone and talk, because I've been home all day and I've been working from home, or we'll talk about the working at home, right? So I've been working from home, but really it's working at home where we have to deal with things like always being on conference calls, always being either on cell phones, kids running around, cars passing by in the background. So all that stuff is now becoming new normal. So that's where we have the main aspect of it.
Yeah, and I think that I don't know who I saw say this, it was probably on Twitter, but like distinguishing between working from home and working at home, I think is like a super interesting way to look at this. Like in general, like if if we were to hear like the pitter patter of toddler feet running over my head right now, or a baby screaming, like the fact that that hasn't happened yet is a small miracle. But like these things are now normal. Like in general, working from home, and I've done it for years, means like me at my house alone, it's quiet. Like if I need to get rid of the dogs for a day, I can get rid of the dogs. Like this is very different. There's kids running around. You know, I've seen like all of my coworkers' kids over the last couple of weeks. So hopefully that part of all of this will change at some point in the future. But I want to ask a question specifically of Mike, and I think this is one of the more interesting things that we can explore is obviously there are going to be many operational changes, but will the threat landscape change at all? Will adversaries adapt or behave differently on account of this new distributed way of working?
Yes. So we already began to see this right towards the beginning of everything. Well, real quick. So Checkpoint released a whole blog or whatnot related to just domains quickly registered, whether it was by attackers or by organizations out there. But the uptick of COVID-related domains began to swerve up real quick at the beginning of this year. And then once March hit, it just skyrocketed. I think it's like over 5,000 domains with just COVID in the name. So actors themselves are doing this because they want you to click that link that is, covidresources.org or .com. So yeah, we definitely saw that uptick. And then we began to see, and we're still seeing, the COVID-related themes, attacks that are happening. So you're starting to see email-based attacks or COVID-related emails coming inbound. Some look legitimate with those suspicious-looking COVID-related domains attached to it. So yeah, they are definitely ramping that up. But then also, right, they're home too. If attackers had a day job, or if this is their day job, they now definitely have more time to focus on their activities, producing new code, and probably using resources like Zoom to collaborate with remote teams, right? So yeah, absolutely. These people are definitely adapting and becoming more agile in their work as well.
Yeah, and I think to that point, like these people always worked from home, so like there might not be any ramp up period. So it'll be interesting to see if that sort of hypothesis ends up coming true. One last question, and I want to ask it of you, Carlos, on the people side of this, and I'm going to use like the most dystopian term I can think of. Is there like a re-education process that needs to happen? Like, is your security training program like, and this is a good segue into the processes, which we'll go to next, but does your complete employee education process change on account of everyone not being in an office and being at home?
I would go ahead and say that it should. One of the things that we build our security programs on is adaptability, right? We want to adapt to the environment. We want to adapt to business strategies. We want to adapt to things that are going on. And this is one of those very important bumps in the road, I guess, or different divergent paths that we could take. When we're talking about this and you're talking about a new normal of working from home, you should start thinking about security awareness training that should change based on what people are aware of. For example, whereas before we should, worry about, what not to put on our computers. Now maybe we should worry about what not to put on our phones. Maybe we should worry about things like, talking loud, in an environment where, yes, you're at home, but there's people that actually live with you that can repeat what you're saying in a private environment. When it comes to privacy, those are the type of things that you have to worry about. Before, you were in an office, you were wearing your headset, most likely. Nowadays, if you put your phone on speaker, you think you're okay because you're at home. But there could be anybody listening in on the next room. It could be that your wife has a friend over, and she works at a certain company that could be a competitor. You never know what you're actually talking about. So those are the type of things that are now different. More also when it comes to incident response. So incident response processes actually also change. Now we're talking about before. We go in and do something specifically to take a computer from somebody's hands if something's wrong with it. Now everybody's working from home. We don't have that ability to send Joy over to actually go ahead and get a computer from somebody. So that part of it has changed as well.
And I think that that's a good segue into the discussion we want to have about sort of processes. I mean, the most obvious process process point that's kind of changed is like work from home policies, right? That job that couldn't be remote, well, it turns out it can be remote. So that's probably been an adjustment that a lot of people have had to make, but it's kind of a boring one. So I want to ask you, Rick, like, what are some specific process challenges you see emerging from these changes that could be potentially problematic?
Yeah, I think there's a few. I think there's a few on the IT side, right? Like how are you building systems and distributing those systems to employees, right? Pretty typical. Like help desk would spin up an image, and have all the security layers put on it, and then it gets delivered to a user's desk, because we all know where users sit, right? Or you mail it FedEx. If you maybe had some of your salespeople remote into the field. So I think there's an opportunity for that to be broken as part of it, right? Because that's a well-baked process that, organizations have matured over time and moved from sort of that manual process to the automated one. So that's where my head goes to a lot, right? Is we've delivered a lot of automated playbooks over IR, thankfully. I think the SOAR industry, I think ourselves, a few other people have sort of led the forefront on that, right? But even when you think about containment, our containment for an incident used to be very rudimentary. Shut off this IP address, right? Ban it. Turn off this port that's doing something wonky that something's plugged into. Hey, I'm gonna take this laptop and isolate it from the rest of the network. Well, we've gotten way more granular in that. And I'll credit, Carbon Black and a few other vendors out there that have just built the tools to do that. But it's like, can I do that if I don't have the tool put on someone's system that is now accessing things from their home box, right? So things I've heard directly from CISOs and IT teams. Hey, we didn't have a plan to give everyone laptops in our org. Like they had desktops, and those desktops were cable locked to a desk. And people couldn't come back into the office. They were already home. Hey, pull out the credit card, buy new systems at Best Buy, send those systems over, and then start to configure them remotely, right? So I think even when you look at probably the maturity level, especially in finance around DLP, and the way that those solutions work, if that's delivered on-prem, and maybe you have a component in your mail server that's in the cloud, but any of the visibility from an endpoint perspective, like if that's not plumbed and you don't have that already delivered for your remote workforce, now I can pontificate a bit and say like some small portion of your workforce probably had that. Your executives probably demanded that they had the ability to access things remote. Maybe some people would be sick, like your head of finance or people who do transfers. So I would assume some of these controls exist for a small population in your organization, but not organizationally wide, right? So I think, again, keeping that eye on the future and starting to design your solutions for a world that's going to be like this, because I don't see us going back.
Yeah, and we're going to dive into that in a minute. But before we go down that road, like I want to ask you, Mike, there is some amount of IT and security work that has to be done on site or is generally done on site. So like what kind of work used to get done on site and like is going to pose issues to IT operations and security operations as they try and start figuring out how to do all this stuff remotely?
Yeah, I think Rick and Carlos highlighted a little bit there. Yeah, no longer are we delivering, laptops to people's desks, or we're not able to control home firewalls with blocking IPs or domains for a containment situation. We can't force everybody to VPN in, or are we allowing split tunneling now? But yeah, even just patching your systems, right? We're home for the next 60 days or however much longer, or if everyone's working from home for the rest of the year, what's our patching strategies as far as, making sure people are safe at home and not clicking even worse things over, or even other just new things that keep cropping up. I think it's all part of it here. We just, these are all new processes we have to figure out. The other thing I remember we had talked about too was saving files on file servers remotely, or are folks going to begin, taking when they're VPNing in, grabbing their files, storing them all locally, or had we already moved to a cloud-based storage solution, saving things in the cloud? Are folks saving it on their own personal cloud-based storage, accounts that they have set up? These are all just kind of things I was thinking about too. And backups. It's kind of a tough one, right? Folks are at home now, you have your personal backup device. Now you're backing up your machine to, my personal hard drive. How are organizations going to adapt to remotely backing up either just files or whole machines? And it kind of goes right back to that rebuilding a machine if it ever goes down, or you have to mail someone that machine, or like Rick mentioned, going to Best Buy and buying a new laptop. How are you going to restore it? Oh, I have my personal backup drive I have to restore from now. These are all big challenges, right? Changes everything.
Yeah, so I think that actually is a good point for us to jump into our next part of this discussion, which I think might be the most interesting part, which is what are the technological ramifications of moving from, an office-centric to a non-office-centric work environment. And I think that the most obvious question to ask here, and one that runs the risk of being somewhat self-serving, considering that 3 out of 4 of us are very, very, very engaged in companies that provide endpoint-based security controls. But what happens to your network-based security controls when your network is kind of gone? It's not entirely gone, but everyone has sort of moved outside that network. So I guess I'll pose that to Carlos.
What happens to those controls? Wow, that's a very good question. So they change. They completely change. So now, like I said before, we were used to looking at the perimeter and the egress points, and now the egress points are all over the place. And sure, some folks could actually go ahead and combat that by doing VPNs or any type of tunneling type environment, so that we can actually control that. But then you start talking about, like Mike said, split tunneling, forced tunneling, conundrums and decisions that you have to make as an IT professional, where do we want to allow certain aspects of our work communication to go outside of our private tunnel. So when it comes to this stuff, the endpoint becomes extremely important. Where somebody may have brought it up on the call earlier and talking about it, I think it was Rick, but he was talking about specifically about going to folks' houses and configuring routers or something like that. Yes, we're not doing that, right? We're going to go ahead and try and use what we have in place. And as a person who works at a larger company, I would go ahead and say that to us, the endpoint protection aspect of it is extremely important. And most security professionals will tell you the same thing. Right now, we can't rely on our network structure, because if we actually forced every single one of our constituents to do forced tunneling through our pipes, we probably wouldn't get a lot of work done, right? So there's an aspect of it. We're not even talking specifically about voice traffic. We're talking about data traffic, right? So maybe voice traffic in some companies is as important as the data traffic that goes through these pipes. So endpoint protection and endpoint controls become the new norm and become the actual focus of what needs to be done. And Rick mentioned it earlier that, I think it was Rick or Mike, I can't remember which one it was, but they were talking about the top 2 threats that we look at and top 2 defense vectors, right? These guys are going to be actually looking at endpoint to actually, protect against these threats. So yes, endpoint becomes the game right now.
And then sort of opening this back up, I'll ask it of you, Rick, what role do you think sort of identity management also becomes more important as we move to a more, distributed workforce?
Yeah, I think if you operate on the fundamental premise that all comms, and I don't care what path that takes, are suspect, right? I mean, if we put the Wayback Machine to 2017 and think about Vault 7 and Vault 8, what did the CIA show us? All of our home routers are suspect. I don't trust any of them. I don't know what firmware version's on there, right? So, and I'm a security professional. I spend time on my router, right? So I'm assuming my voice traffic is intercepted at some point. I'm assuming my data traffic is intercepted, and that becomes incumbent on me to protect, right? So when I think about what do the bad guys actually want, right? Well, what they want is to make it, they want to get paid and or they want to exfil data and then use that in some monetary fashion. And I don't care if it's a nation state actually gathering it for intelligence purposes. Like intrinsically, it's valuable. That's why they're stealing it. The vector that they're using is identity, right? Whether that's I'm stealing a doctor's login so that I can resell that on the dark web for $350 a pop, whether that's my credentials and access to, some website that I use, or my Windows password, right? The keys to the kingdom, or an admin account. What am I going to do with that? I'm going to elevate privileges. I'm going to run PowerShell so I stay stealthy and it looks like a system administrator is taking some activity. There's probably, as part of a COVID response, I'm sure there's a lot of teams that are writing new PowerShell code to do some of this stuff and facilitate it remote. So security might be looking at that and going, this all looks abnormal, right? For me, I think having deep visibility into what that identity is doing, when is it doing, and then can I associate that with processes, and then associate those processes with packets, right? And technology exists for that. When I start to put that picture together, and really focus around, again, the identity and the credentials, I think you've got a better chance than other shops of stopping it, and you sure have a better chance than 211 days to detect it and boot them out of your environment.
So we got a question, and Carlos already dove into this a little bit, but I want to just make sure we cover it in its entirety, since we did get a question from the audience about it. And that my question was going to be like, sort of, do you foresee people focusing more on endpoint controls? I think Carlos kind of already answered that one. I'm going to ask this of you, Mike. So Joshua asked, is it as simple as just deploying an institution's endpoint security suite on the endpoints in your employees' homes? I mean, I'm not entirely sure how to answer that question. Like, wouldn't you already have those endpoint controls installed on those machines? But like more broadly than that, is there anything else that we should be thinking about in terms of our endpoint controls as everyone moves back to their home, Mike?
Yeah, sure. I saw another post here from Joshua as well. I think it's going to be a couple different pieces, right? So if you didn't have visibility before on every machine in your environment, then yeah, you will most likely move to a place where you will get visibility across those endpoints. The other tricky part is if you didn't have, let's say, like your antivirus product exposed to the web, like an on-prem internal only console check-in type thing. If it was never exposed to the web, now everyone's remote, they're not able to check in, there's going to be complications, right? Because they may not get, the latest definitions or a new definition that was needed during, an incident where you guys got custom ones built. I think a lot of those are going to be really hard and tricky to figure out, and kind of leading to your next, kind of like the question you had, or piece that you had posed in the chat there. Most organizations probably had a point where they started with VPN required for everybody, push everything through the pipes and the tunnels. I remember at my last org, we had 3 different data centers around the world, and just to try to equalize the load of potentially 50,000 people VPNing in at once. It's a tough thing to build and architect, because we didn't expect IP phones and everyone's laptops and every on-demand application constantly communicating in. And then we have folks potentially streaming, whether it's audio or video. It all adds in. So hopefully that answers your question. If not, Carlos, Rick, feel free to chime in.
Well, go ahead, Brian.
You go.
Well, I wanted to chime in a little bit because I saw Josh's question, and I think the differentiator here is: are we caring not just about the company-issued devices, but also about devices that are in people's homes, and how do we go ahead and do those? And I can go ahead and tell you that I have friends in the business that a lot of their folks weren't prepared for this, and they have folks that are working from home, and these guys are actually using endpoint devices that were not company issued, right? Were not configured that way. And most companies nowadays are actually, are putting endpoint devices, their own personal endpoint devices their own company endpoint devices on personal machines. The main reason is because, unfortunately, as much as you could actually have a virus scan or anything like that up to date, There is the biggest issue with using somebody else's endpoint or using some other non-controlled endpoint is the behavior analysis, right? So you have to go ahead and be able to actually say, okay, these processes are behaving a certain way, and you can't do that unless you have that ability, built into your endpoint protection. So if you have that, then go ahead and plug it into somebody's machine. That's what I would do. Another aspect of it, and then I don't know if I'm talking out of turn or if I'm going too far into it, but the phone aspect of it, the cell phones, right? I mean, we have people that are using personal cell phones now to actually make communications and calls and using work environments. And if you didn't have that control before, right, that's something that you should actually look into now. MDM is key. Making sure that the devices that are out there are actually being tracked as far as what's happening on them is key. So you can't just go ahead and expect, for example, Joey Jr. Installed some really cool app that his kid brother has been using on another phone that didn't belong to the company, but now because he wanted to go ahead and play with them, he's using your dad's phone, and that's making a phone call, and all of a sudden this phone call is getting recorded. So those are the type of things that you have to start thinking about. MDM, process of behavior analysis, all that stuff within those endpoints that you didn't have before. So the answer would be yes. And something that just came across my desk today, and I just found out that there's a COVID-19 app, right? That's actually out there now that's promising real-time updates, but it's actually, if you install it, and this is that obviously security professionals are gonna look at the permissions, but if you install it without looking at those permissions, there's a vast majority of permissions that these guys are using to actually read everything on your phone. So I had to go take my kid out and tell him, hey, I know you have an Android device. You're not going to go ahead and install anything that promises any COVID-19 real-time information. He goes, no, Dad, I got better sources than that. I go, okay, well, that's cool.
Yeah, Carlos, I think you hinted at something key there too, right? Which is like employee and home users that are on their home systems that have privacy concerns too, right? So, I mean, that's definitely something you're going to have to consult with your legal team. Hopefully, you had some sort of BYOD policy that outlines that and people sign up to. But I would imagine there's some folks in your org that are going to have hesitancy to providing full visibility to their home system, right? And so look, I don't have a solution for that. Mostly I would work with the leaders of my organization to figure that out, right? But I think for security professionals out there, yeah, it's something that we should consider as we look at the world moving forward post-COVID is we're going to butt up against a lot of privacy issues. And I think it's incumbent on us to make sure that we're balancing that correctly, right? The safety versus privacy.
So I do want to ask one specific question to you, Rick, that Carlos sort of got into, but I'd like to expand on it just slightly. And that's like, to what degree are employers going to accept responsibility over networking gear in their employees' houses? Like, are you going and configuring firewalls and routers or what?
I've done both. So I will say there's a historical precedent for doing that. I've talked to some CISOs and weirdly enough, they were like big brands, but small companies, right? That happens on the West Coast a lot, especially up north. You just wind up with a big brand and you have like 50 to 100 employees, right? So the job's a little different. Maybe you had the capacity to go configure some Palo Altos or some Fortinets, right? And get those into some sort of managed configuration. You're using some of the modules like network AV, maybe DLP, all of that good stuff, right? That being said, one of the cool things about the cloud, right, is it actually does solve some of these problems. So I think I'm not going to endorse any particular vendor that's out there, right? But I think it's easier to send people a PCAP file or could configure a proxy on their web browser to go through the cloud and just have that exist. Hopefully some orgs out there, and seemingly based on the product space, like they've sold a lot of product and they're doing pretty well on revenues, right? But yeah, I in particular to network security controls for remote employees, I heavily endorse the cloud for those services, right? And no, they're not going to get everything perfect, but it's certainly easier from a management perspective to manage 1 or 2 or 5 configurations, depending on the groups of employees, over hundreds of devices that you send out there, right? But if you are concerned about router security and stuff, there's tools for all of that, right? I'm sure Cisco would sell you a bunch of management gear and Linksys boxes to help, right?
So I wanted to ask this question multiple slides ago, and I just realized that I forgot to ask it. And now, time-wise, it may be a mistake to go down this rabbit hole, but I'm going to do it anyway. Do you think that this change, like, is going to be a bigger problem for large established enterprises or for smaller enterprises? And I will start with Mr. Michael Haig.
I personally feel I think it's almost like a little bit of middle of the road of an answer. I think small orgs may benefit because it's just sometimes easy to expand and flow out from working from home. They may not require a lot of hardware and equipment in like a data center to continue operations. They might be completely cloud-based. Whereas a very large organization, they were probably prepared for all the VPNs and managing everything internally and partially cloud-based apps. I don't know. I'm kind of torn between the two.
Anything to add there, Carlos?
I am going to add a little bit to that since I've actually worked at both, in security at both. So it's funny because like I see I think Mike is completely right in the fact that it's middle of the road. But if you take a look at the large company, you would think that the large company is going to have a hard time adapting to this environment because it's such a large company, right? But what we don't see is that when it comes to large multinational companies, most of them actually behave, and that's the difference between macroeconomics and microeconomics, right? Most of the folks in a global multinational company behave as small fractions that actually have their own either culture or their own behaviors based on a corporate policy, right? So when it comes to adapting in this environment, those larger corporations could actually benefit from being those small factions and actually adapting quicker pace based on what the different factions need. At the same time, small companies, whereas you would think, okay, they're small companies, so they should be easier to adapt. A lot of them are probably, and this is something that Rick mentioned earlier, they're turning to the cloud, right? So as an example that we brought up when we were first started actually thinking about topics for the seminar is the small company that has a on-premise server for the data files, right? And now, because of the situation with COVID-19, we're working remotely. And now that particular environment is no longer an on-premise server that could only be accessed from there, and now has to be somewhere else. We could be VPN'd in and work that way. But a lot of companies are turning to the cloud. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which way you look at it, the aspect of the cloud there's a little aspect of the cloud that scares people, and the fact that the cloud is built for ease of use, right? It's not built for security, and a lot of default settings in most of these cloud environments, when it comes to actually just putting some sort of a sandbox up there, is a very hard thing to do. So we're going from an environment that people were actually using a server inside of a brick and mortar store or whatever, or a brick and mortar office, and it was secure there because it was there, to this virtual place up in the cloud where if you didn't secure it right and you didn't configure it right, you didn't do your job, or you didn't actually hire somebody that knows what they're doing, there's a good possibility that you're now open to the world with the data that you worked so hard to actually protect in the first place. So it is middle of the road. There's some small companies that are going to do great, and there's some small companies that are going to need help, and if they don't know where to look, are going to need a lot of help later on.
All right, I'm gonna skip you on this one, Rick, because we unfortunately have to move ahead. So, looking into the future, I would say like the cat is out of the bag. So I've seen a lot of people, again, on Twitter, I spend too much time there, talking about like, let's not call this the new normal. It's not the new normal, but I hate to break it to you, like some of this is the new normal. Like not everything is going to go back to the way it was before. And I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? That there's going to be good outcomes from this. There's going to be bad outcomes, and there's frankly going to be ones that are entirely indifferent. So I'll start with Rick because we skipped him on the last question. Like, what are some of the positive changes that could come to be as a result of this pandemic?
It's funny, right? I mean, work from home / VPNs. My mother-in-law used to work for John Hancock for years. She was doing remote work like in the mid 90s, right? So for some organizations out there, the humans were the holdup, right? There was probably some leadership holdup. I don't trust my people to be working remote. I don't trust that they're going to be effective. I would say largely things are still kind of working, right? Like, you know, there's some things that take a little longer, but things are largely working for organizations. So look, I think organizations, especially CFOs, are going to start to look at the economic savings, right? I think organizations out there are going to start to look at their ability to diversify who they're hiring, right? It's a problem in San Diego. If I go looking for threat hunters, as an example, right? There's only so many of us, and we all kind of just change companies, right? And when we kind of move around in a group, so one CISO is recruiting against another CISO for resources because there's only so many of them, right? So I think it'll widely open that up, and hopefully you'll find some better people that are remote, and you know, you manage them like you would any other employee, right? It'll help some of the managers out there that have maybe managed and are used to managing people in person rather than managing a remote team. To Carlos's earlier point, there's not too many companies that don't do global business these days, that don't have, you know, some business unit somewhere that, you know, requires that remote interaction. So I think as humans, it's a skill we're going to have to put time into. So I see some large economic benefits in an organization of, you know, even if you think about retrofitting a building for sustainability in California, like that's a huge cost, right? You're trying to drive that carbon footprint down. Like, well, I have a bunch of time savings and money savings from that, right? And you'll probably see workplace incidents go down as a result, which I'm sure will make some HR teams happy.
Do you have anything to add there, Mike?
I'll happily talk about the excellent ability to have a very short commute now. I'm sure a lot of people have noticed, right? Your car is sitting longer, and you're able to have the shorter commute from bed to work, 10 feet, maybe 30. So, but yeah, I think that's definitely a benefit. Everyone's able to cut that time down of, you know, 30 minutes to drive or an hour of driving. Maybe it grants that more time to focus on, you know, podcast more or some other kind of training material.
Yeah, and I think that Carlos had brought that up. So there were actually two things that
Yeah.
Carlos brought up that I'd like to give him the opportunity to speak to here. One is like sort of increased training opportunities for your employees. And then the other one that I found might be the most interesting is sort of how this will make us more technically resilient.
Yeah, excellent. So the first one, I have a quick quip on that one. You know, what do geeks do when you give them more free time? Well, it's really simple. Play video games or learn more about geeky things, and that's what we do. So yeah, so it's great that we have all this free training and free webinars, because I think a lot of us are taking advantage of it. In fact, I think if I go down my org, and I actually did it the other day, 70% of my team is actually doing some sort of training nowadays in the past 2 months, whether it's free or something remote that they've actually paid for. As far as technical resilience, that's actually a good point. That we are in the process right now of testing our resiliency programs. We're testing BCP, we're testing DR, and we have the ability now to actually move from this and do a lessons learned aspect of it that we couldn't do. We're talking about real live lessons learned on a resiliency program that maybe before you couldn't test because it was so hard to test, at least for global companies, right? That it was so hard to test because you couldn't test it all at once. Well, guess what? The past 2 months, we've tested it all. And we've come away with, you know, lessons learned. We've come away with good environments, bad environments, and now we know what's going on. So that is a huge positive outcome of this.
So, of course, it's not all sort of, you know, rainbow and butterflies. So, like, Rick, what do you think are some of the bad outcomes that are going to result from this?
Yeah, I mean, we were the hotness, right? Like if you looked at the last 20 years and what we were spending in InfoSec and what we're spending now, I want to say it's $86 billion, you know, market cap, right? Or so, something like that. It's crazy, right? So, so what happens? Leaders get distracted. To Carlos's point, we just shook up our companies. We just shook up our resiliency plans, and there'll be a lot of projects and time that comes out of that. And security will be a part of that. I mean, after all, the third leg of the CIA triad's availability, right? So we're putting in on that. We're putting time, but that time may take away from some other projects that you already had in the hopper. Certainly, I think we're feeling this on the vendor side. side, where it's like shifting priorities just happened. You know, we're going to go down a different path because we have to, and it's more important, right? So I think macro level, that's huge. The second one I think about, because I'd like Carlos and Mike to cover the other two, but is how much compliance we're actually breaking as a result of this, right? So whether you had on-plan deployments of DLP, whether I'm a healthcare provider who faxes things and now faxes aren't available at people's houses, so I have to send that back through email. I believe on the other side of this, there will be a lot of litigation, and there will be a lot of compliance fines as a result. Right now, hopefully we all wrap that up underneath. We had to do what we had to do to keep businesses up and running, but I highly doubt that. I mean, people aren't working, and typically when governments are broke, fines go up because they're going to get that revenue somehow. So I would expect some large orgs to probably be facing some fines, which is sad, right? Because we had to keep the companies up and running.
And then Carlos, like, so I've talked to a number of people that have been or heard secondhand more than talked directly to people, but I've heard, like, you know, just across the board, cut X amount or X% of your team. So, I mean, layoffs are a very real possibility. Does the prospect of layoffs and sort of insider threat activity emanating from layoffs cause you concern?
Yes, absolutely. When we're talking, I mean, as a person, it causes me concerns, right? Because I hate to see my brethren actually get cut, or myself. You know, it's our bread and butter. My neighbor, you know, his company went through some sort of a salary reduction. My other neighbor here owns his own company, and he's having issues, you know, with that aspect. So when I look at the personal aspect of it, yes, it hurts, and that's right. But you brought up a really good point. The insider threat aspect of somebody getting laid off, and it's just hard. I mean, coming from a company that does a lot of mergers and acquisitions, you know, that insider threat aspect of it is something that we're always looking at. So it's something as a security professional, whatever company you're in, anytime you have a climate where people are actually either losing their jobs or reducing their salary, and you have no idea of how that's affecting them in the personal side of it, whether it's maybe their spouse lost their job as well, or spouse get their salary reduced as well. So when you're thinking, oh, well, it was only 5% that we cut salaries across the board. Well, for this particular person, it could have been 5% plus a whole other job, right? A whole other salary. So when that happens, people look at different avenues to make money, or different avenues to actually get back at things. So I just hope that we have a really good, as far as, you know, we as in the security world have a really good way of dealing with these terminations, dealing with some of these changes, so that we're looking at behaviors either post announcement or pre-announcement, or, you know, even, you know, way past the announcement. So we know that, you know, there's things that are being done, and we're actually taking a look at these things as well.
So I'm going to skip over the point on attackers getting better, because I think Heg sort of already covered that earlier in the presentation. So, like, what about things that are sort of neither good nor bad, or kind of unknown? And I think the one that we kind of talked about most, and for the sake of time, we'll probably just focus on this one, is reliance on vendors. And I'll let Mike lead on that one.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this a bit ago, because in my head, I was like, as a security leader, I hope that at this point, however long you've been at the organization, that you've picked the right vendors through your process and diligence of looking for products and organizations that will help you, you know, during times of incidents, or, you know, for security products, times of incidents, or if a hardware appliance goes down. Hopefully you've gotten those, like, sorted out, and you're able to rely, because they do have the expertise. That's their product, that's their service. They're able to, you know, jump in when you really need it. But then on the other side of it, they might be losing money too. They could potentially be losing other customers right now, because a very large customer might say, you know what, we'll just take this in-house, or a small customer might say, we just can't afford it. We would just be better without it. So yeah, it's tricky, because there's obviously, like, that balance, you know, and yeah. And I know there's also, like, the good out of it in a way, which is in 6 months, or say you're agreement's up in another month or so, you might be able to get better pricing. And I know, Carlos, you had a lot to say about the vendor piece here too, how things might play out in that part, which is awesome.
Yeah, well, Rick mentioned it earlier. I mean, we're talking about breaking compliance, right? So a lot of us rely on vendors to keep up compliance. If we have vendors that are actually going through the same things we're going through, as far as losing, headcount, reducing salaries, getting maybe the possibility of insider threats within them, and we rely on them, and we actually have agreements with them where they are actually guarding our information or guarding our data. I mean, we're talking about a whole different avenue here that we have to go ahead and justify to the regulators, to other people, as to why we're using this vendor because of that. And then, yeah, the other part of it is I'm actually going. I made up a point. I'm going through a paint job on my exterior fence right now, and I had a quote 2 months ago that's actually $2,000 less. I mean, more than what I'm actually paying now. That's just the way the economy is going. So when you look at that from the vendor's point of view, yes, that's a good part. Now we're going to get better pricing from vendors, and that's great. At the same time, though, I feel bad for some of the vendors that were actually driving up the competitive spirit and the actual innovation that was actually happening within vendors and within markets, because there were so many people in the field, and smaller companies and smaller vendors were actually taking over. I'll stop talking because I just noticed a lot more.
Yeah, so time is pretty tight here. So I just want to jump ahead so we can actually give people maybe something to do, like to take away from this. So like in terms of actions you can take away and do tomorrow. Mike, what do you think of, like, sort of on the endpoint and identity management side? Like what can people do?
Which Mike?
Peg.
So definitely stay focused on the endpoint as much as you can. If there's a way to gather that visibility using an EDR type tool, and dropping into a place to perform analysis on it, either real time or over time. I think that's going to benefit you immensely at this point. Identity management as well. You're going to, if you're using a lot of cloud tools and you don't have those things going somewhere to be monitored or reviewed, now is probably the time to get that going. If you have it being monitored, definitely confirm that things are really being monitored by maybe executing something that will generate that alert. Just make sure things are actually happening. And I know we're getting short, so I'll let Rick or Carlos hop in here.
Compliance changes, Carlos. You're muted.
Muted. Sorry, twice in one day. Everybody taking shots. All right. Compliance changes. One word. Document. Document everything, and you actually go ahead. If you document everything, you're going to go ahead and take care of those three. And I don't want to take over or rig stuff, but if you document your exceptions, you document everything that's actually going on, your regulators are going to be a lot easier on you when it comes to time to say why you did a certain thing. If you document your lessons learned from your forced audit that you're going through right now, you're going to be better off later on in the next few months when this is all over. And of course, if you document everything, you document all these one-offs, then you're going to be able to actually go back to the way it was a lot easier than if you actually didn't know whether you actually took out forced tunneling for one particular faction of your organization or not.
Do you have any thoughts on the forced audit aspect of this, Rick?
Yeah, look, I mean, we all got hit by the 2x4, right? Like right to the face, like the whole globe at once. So I go back to my military background, right, and being a Marine, and it's like, look, plan for those worst case scenarios, learn from failure on the battlefield, and then adapt as quickly as you can, right? So look, you're going to break a bunch of stuff. You probably got audit teams you can't send on site to do attestations right now, right? Like that's happening. So the biggest thing I'll say is Carlos nailed it. Keep a list of all your exceptions, track all of that stuff, keep a list of all the tactical items you're going to have to quickly do, and then those strategic items to get your organization in a better place. It's not about failing. It's about how we learn from that failure and then move through it, right? So that's my big bright advice is we're going to get better as a result of this. I know for a fact as an industry we'll get better.
And I'll just cover the last point really quickly. Like the organizations that planned for something like this occurring are probably in a better place than those that didn't today. And likewise, you should be planning for what a return to some level of normalcy should look like. And maybe you should start that planning right now. So we did have one lingering question. It was about how you can, it's about how you can sort of impose security controls on employee-owned devices without a BYOD policy. I think we sort of covered that in as many words, and we don't have time to cover it now. So the last thing I want to do here is just do a quick plug. So VMware Carbon Black Connect is the week after next week. I'm going to drop a registration link into the chat real quick. And along with that, I'm going to drop a link where you guys can pick up some free Red Canary t-shirts if you want them, and a link to Carbon Black's cybersecurity outlook report and Red Canary's threat detection report. And those are all incoming now. Last but not least, thank you everybody for joining us today. I know we went a few minutes over, just 1 minute over, so sorry for that. Also, thanks Rick, Carlos, and Mike for joining us. And with that, I'm going to close things out.